Well, welcome to another episode of OTA on the Air. Today with me is Beth Carroll, and she is going to be one of our keynote speakers at the annual conference coming up in September this year. So, Beth, welcome joining me on our OTA on the Air podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself, your history, and some of the work that you've done.
Well, I am a compensation consultant, which most people don't realize that it actually is a thing. There's like certifications and stuff that you can do to become a certified compensation consultant, compensation professional. I've been doing it for about 24 years now. I started with a big HR consulting firm. And then at the beginning of 2008, I left to start my own company. And just happily, coincidentally, I happened to be working with a freight broker at the time. And so that kind of became my start with working with transportation companies. And so going from, one client in 2008, I've now worked with over 300 transportation and logistics companies to help them revamp their compensation programs. And really what I focus on is variable compensation. So it's pay for performance. Anything where you want people's pay to basically go up and down based on either the company's results or their individual performance or some combination thereof. So I can also do basic salary structure stuff too, but I don't do that as often. Usually it's a part of an overall broader full-scale compensation redo where we're also looking at incentive compensation design.
So you also have written a book called Taming the Compensation Monster. Have a copy here with us. So talk a little bit about the book, what what inspired that, and I guess some things that you learned in that process.
Well, I'm if we go way back in my history, I at one point wanted to be a professor, at another point wanted to be an author. And so this sort of was pulling all of that stuff finally together for me. But I had been writing articles for the Logistics Journal, which was the TIA, Transportation Intermediaries Association publication. It's now become 3PL Perspective, but it's basically their publication. And I just got started writing a series of like, how would you design a compensation plan, like beginning to end? Because it's a very standard process, right? The process that I take my clients through is the same one that we used at my big HR consulting firm. It's the same one consultants everywhere use. You assess, you design, you test, you communicate, right? I mean, this is not rocket science in terms of how you go about it. But a lot of people, when they're thinking about compensation, they start in exactly the wrong place, right? So like I'll have, particularly with like freight brokers, I'll have them come to me and they'll say, well, what should the commission rate be? It's like, well, I don't even know if you should be paying a commission. I can't answer the rate question if I don't know how much salary you have, right? And I don't even know what you want them to do. So there's so many things that you have to address before you get to like the mechanics of how you're going to pay somebody. I just kind of started writing an article, a series that just went in terms of, okay, start with role definition, start with org structure, then start with target total comp, and then pay mix, and then go into all the mechanics. And when I got to about the 6th article in the series, I was like, you know what, this is a book. And so I took those articles and everything else that I had kind of written that made sense and just kind of knitted it together. It became like a quilt that I put together. I'm working on another one. I actually have written the final article in the series. And so now I get to put together the quilt and this one's going to be focused on trucking companies. So it's how do you do incentive compensation for all of the myriad different roles that exist within a trucking company, from load planner, customer service rep, driver manager, those are the easy ones. Sales, obviously easy. Recruiter, relatively easy, but even talking about things like accounting and HR and mechanics and safety, and all of those different roles that you really like, you can't talk traditional, like you can't pay them a commission. What are you going to pay them a commission on? Right. So you have to come up with very different ways of compensating those people. And I've done, probably 50 or so of those projects now, where my trucking company clients, that are asset based, they want everybody in the organization on variable compensation, IT, HR, marketing, right? And so I've had to figure out ways to make it manageable, to do incentive compensation, variable compensation for those roles when you're dealing with incredibly different performance metrics, right? The KPIs that you have available for those groups are just different. You can't tie it directly to bottom line results from the business. So that's going to be my second book. It's going to be all about, it's going to be a Taming the Compensation Monster 2 for trucking, for asset-based
For
companies.
asset-based.
Yep.
So in chapter 2 of your book, you talk about what are the top 6 compensation mistakes. I guess, what are you seeing, and maybe this is a precursor to the book, but like from the trucking industry perspective, are the mistakes that they make the same mistakes that are being made by the logistics industry? I guess, what are you seeing as far as what those mistakes are?
Excellent question. They're different, right? So, and what always fascinates me is this industry is so diverse in terms of the type of business models that exist and the culture from the different companies. And if you think about the fact that there are a whole lot of asset-based trucking companies out there that have a freight brokerage attached to them, either small or huge, right? And you think about just the cultural difference between those two types of organizations is massive. And it doesn't come up any stronger, I think, than in terms of compensation. Typically within asset-based companies, you don't have a lot of variable pay. You typically are more high salary, lower incentive type designs, which makes sense. Whereas freight brokers, some of them are 100% commission. So you can have really, and that creates creates a cultural difference that can become really toxic if you have those people sitting right next to each other. So I, in terms of the mistakes that they make, they're really very different, right? So the freight brokerage world is going to make a mistake of being too commission heavy, right? And not really thinking through the consequences of being too commission heavy. On the asset side, it's going to be one of two things. It's going to be either they haven't done anything in terms of variable compensation or incentive compensation, and everybody's just paid salary or hourly rate, right? Or they maybe have bitten off more than they can chew. So everybody knows the story of Prime, or at least I think everybody knows the story of Prime in the circles that I run in. And I have nothing to do with this. The leaders of Prime created their incentive compensation plan long before I was on the scene. Bless them for doing it. But they have everybody in their organization, down to the receptionist, is on variable compensation. And it is heavily KPI driven. And all this is hearsay. I've never actually seen it, but this is what I've been told. In some cases, weekly incentive pay. Okay. This was in their DNA from the start, right? Like they started their company, I think, practically with this idea, with this philosophy, and they have figured out how to do it. And I think it's distributed in terms of management. So it's not a burden on one person to try to manage all this. And I think a lot of companies have seen that and have seen the success that they have had, and they want to replicate that, but they don't recognize what's going to go into that for them to try to do it, right? And they haven't really come to grips with the fact that if you are measuring your people in your accounting department on a weekly basis in terms of the number of their bills that they're processing, and you're paying them an incentive based on that, somebody's got to calculate it, right? There's cost that goes into that. And you have to take a really long, hard look at the ROI. What are you actually getting? And what are you rewarding them for? It's piece rate, right? In that kind of a world, you're doing something that's a piece rate plan. Do they control how many bills they get? No, right? It's just a function of the business. You would, in my opinion, you would be almost just as well served to have them be paid based on, monthly company results. It's going to be the same idea. If the company's processing more bills, they're going to make more money. They're going to have a bigger incentive. But some organizations want that. So I'm not saying it's a wrong thing to do if the company is set up to do that and it has it in their culture and their DNA to do it. But I think the biggest mistake is that the asset-based companies will chase an idea like that without really understanding what's involved.
Yeah, as you're talking through this, I was part of a trucking company before I started here, and I had done a compensation change in the way we were compensating our drivers, and I'm going to be very interested to read the articles and read the book, because I'm sure I made every mistake in that entire process. So, but I guess talk a little bit about, it seems like a lot of the stuff is, based on sales folks and office staff and whatnot. I guess, what are you seeing as some of the challenges when it comes to driver pay and the impact that, that some of the things that good trucking companies are doing when it comes to that side of the house?
Driver pay is, I'd say, the bane of my existence at this point. I've done a couple of the projects. I've maybe 10 or so, 10, 15 driver pay projects. They're incredibly complicated, not complicated so much from a design perspective. Usually it takes about one meeting to get everybody to lay out what their thoughts are in terms of how they want the drivers to be compensated. The complexity comes in when you're trying to make the change. You have to model everything. The data usually is pretty wonky in terms of what you've got available. I've done it projects where we've had to take I've had to have somebody like code in stuff off of paper trip sheets in order to try to get all the data or stuff, just, and I've had so many clients now, our data is great. Our data is going to be wonderful. And then we start digging into it and we find out, no, there's all these circumstances where the driver managers can override what the driver is paid. They give them some extra bump to try to get them to take the load or whatever. And that throws all our data off. Right. So it's like, I can't actually model, old pay to new pay, because what I'm looking at in terms of the strict statistics that were used weren't actually what caused them to be paid the way they were paid, right? So there's this gap between what your old plan says they should have been paid and what they actually were paid. And it's like, well, what's that from? Well, somebody just gave them an extra whatever because they didn't want to do the trip. Or so there's a mess that goes into it in terms of getting the data, and nobody wants to do anything that's going to take pay away from drivers, right? So that's the first rule of driver compensation, is you are not making any kind of a reduction. When the second rule that people want is they want to simplify it. They want to simplify it. They want to normalize it. They want to make it easier to understand, because over time, companies have gotten 75 pay codes because they've, we asked the driver to do tarping. So we've got to add that on, and they have a backhaul, and we got to add that on, and we got to have a layover pay, and we got to have detention pay, and we got to have breakdown pay, and we got to have whatever else. Like I've worked with companies that have literally 75 different pay codes. And not just for stuff like, holiday bereavement, the normal things you would expect. It's all these other things. And so they want to reduce, and most of them contribute a couple dollars. I mean, it's nothing. If you look at all those pay codes, there's usually, mileage. For most long haul carriers, mileage is going to be the big one, right? There's going to be one big one. And then if they pay per diem or not, if they have any sort of layover pay or detention pay, those are going to be the next couple big ones. And so you really have maybe 3 or 4 that pay 80 to 90% of the pay. But the minute you tell a driver that you're taking one of those other things away, that doesn't even mean anything to them, that might have paid them $2 over the last year, they're going to flip out about it because they feel like something is being taken away from them. So I've done these projects, and I'd say I don't know that I'm at half, right, where it actually gets implemented, which is really frustrating. And so now I've gotten to the point with clients, when they're asking me about driver pay, I'll say, you have to be serious that you are going to make this change. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to hire me. It doesn't make sense to take your team through the time and energy and effort that it's going to be to do this work, if at the end of the day, you're going to chicken out and you're just going to raise them all a penny a mile, right? If that's where you're going to end up, be honest about it and just do it now, right? Don't waste all the time and energy and effort doing it. So and that's unfortunately in more than half of the cases, I think that's what the companies have just done. They've done all this analysis and exercise and everything, and hopefully they got some benefit out of it. But in the end, they just take all their 75 pay codes and bump them up 5%.
Well, is part of the challenge there the complexity and how complex we've gotten with driver pay, trying to pay for every little thing?
Yep.
Is that the challenge, or is it, I guess, from when it comes from an implementation standpoint, you talk about taking it away, and which is something that we did as well. And we received rebuff from drivers about, dropping the legs on the trailer, that they're no longer being compensated for that. So someone should do that for them. I guess, is it the perceptual issue of loss, or is it they just don't understand it's so complex that nobody can really understand it?
It's both. I think it's really both, right? And throw in like regulatory impacts and the need for any company that's dealing with California or any of the West Coast states, that they need to have an hourly rate equivalent in there. And a lot of them are sort of, been reading the tea leaves and saying, hey, we want to make sure that we can very quickly pivot to an hourly equivalent if we need to, or that we have a base, $15 an hour or $20 an hour or whatever it is, that then we tack mileage and safety and everything else on top of. And I'm sure some people out there just flipped out, because I've talked to many an owner who've said, over my dead body, will the drivers ever be paid by the hour, right? But some of them are trying to figure out a way to do a blend. And if you ask me to put on my compensation hat, I've spent 24 years thinking about compensation. I think the right way to do driver pay is going to be some combination of an hourly rate that's going to be your catch-all for things like dropping the legs, right? Tarping, all that kind of stuff. And then you've got strong incentive compensation for miles and safety and all of the other factors that they do have more control over. And ideally, you'd probably want it to be about a 50-50 pay mix, right? So if you think about the way you talk about sales compensation, you talk about what percentage is salary and what percentage is their incentive or their commission, right? And so that would be like a 50-50 pay mix would mean if they have 100,000 target total comp, they get 50,000 salary and they have a 50,000 target incentive. I don't think it's unreasonable to talk about driver pay in the same way, right? And to think about whatever their hourly rate is times the hours that you expect them to be counted, that would be equivalent to their fixed pay or their base wage kind of thing. And then there should be a good solid 50% that's based variable. Mileage pay is by definition variable, right? So that's going to be the thing that really determines, do they make 40,000, maybe what they get just off the hours, and then they get another 20 to 40 on the performance factors.
So I guess since miles per or pay per mile, cents per mile is so ingrained in the industry.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this would then overlap into other areas as well, is how do you change that mindset from employees, or when you're implementing these strategies, what are some of the key takeaways that you've seen that help implement those, that make implementation easier, especially when it comes to the mindset of employees that are used to, hey, my pay is this. And to
Right.
give an example is, the trucking company I worked for used to be a union shop, and they went away from that, 30 years before I got there. But they're still paying every week based on that mentality. How do you get over that perceptual hurdle when it comes to changing compensation?
That is the tough part, right? So nobody out there, well, that's not entirely true. There are some companies out there that are sitting in a much better shape than others in terms of attracting and retaining drivers. Not any over the road for hire companies that I'm aware of. So the ones that basically are pulling the drivers are going to be your private fleets. So they're going to be, Walmart, Cisco, McLean, US Foods, right? These guys, because the driver, the delivery is not the product. The delivery is ancillary to the product. So they have very different margins than for hire carriers have. And so they have more flexibility in terms of actually being able to make changes. They've got more power, right? They provide, most of those drivers are home, if not nightly, weekly. They have better benefits. They have a lot more going for them. The problem with the over the road carriers, and fundamentally, I don't think it's a compensation problem, is the nature of the job is so difficult and unappealing that it is very hard to keep drivers in this world. And so changing compensation is just going to be a non-starter until some of the other factors are taken care of. And I know a number of my clients have been talking about doing more of a hub and spoke kind of situation like the LTL carriers do. LTL carriers don't have nearly as much of a problem attracting and retaining drivers. When I first, I I was still pretty new in the industry, but I had bounced around enough to have some statistics in my head. And I went to my first LTL carrier and they said, oh, well, our driver turnover has been going up. You know, it's like 6%. And I went, 60? Did you say 60? And they said, no, 6. And I went, what? Talking about? Because I just been so used to feeling, you know, the long haul carriers being like north of 80, 90, 100.
Right.
And so I think until the fundamentals of the job change, I don't think there's a whole lot that can be done because the drivers have all the power, you know, and they are not going to accept the changes. And if you make a change that they're not happy with, they're going to leave. So until something is done that makes it a more attractive job for them to have, the companies are just kind of stuck doing what they've always been doing. I don't know that there's a way out of it.
And that's actually a very refreshing perspective, because I think that's
maybe depressing.
Well, I mean, the interesting part is I think that's the big argument that we always see between OOIDA and the American Trucking Association and the industry is it's all about driver pay. We're not paying enough. It's all about pay. And I agree with you. I do not believe that pay is the determining factor on why we're having such a hard time getting our workforce in place, and retaining our workforce is it's not a pay issue. It's
not. I mean, and we're not talking that much in terms of dollars. I mean, yeah, if you think about, you know, 60,000 would sort of be 60 to 65. I think these days is kind of the going rate. It's going up fast. I know that, for an over the road driver. And in your private fleets, you're probably going to be seeing 75 to 80, you know, kind of as the norm in the private fleets. And then you have to say, okay, is that kind of a pay difference going to really justify 6% turnover versus 80% turnover? I don't think so. Yeah.
So you're presenting at our annual conference, and it's talking about maximizing employee motivation through creative compensation. And you address a number of issues that kind of piqued my interest about things like bounties. You're gonna have to explain that one to me. KPI tables, goal-based performance, MBOs, and development scorecards. I guess talk me through those items and what the viewers who attend convention can expect to hear about those.
Yeah, so this was all born out of working with the asset-based companies and being asked to, you know, well, hey, we need to have something for our accounting department. We can't just have an incentive compensation plan for our driver managers and our load planners and our customer service reps and sales. You know, we have to come up with something for these other groups. And you can't, as I said before, you can't go to your normal types of things, you know, paying them on, you know, revenue per week per truck is in accounting or IT. Why would that even make sense for them? Right. It just isn't going to work. So you have to look at some of these other things. So let me start with bounty. So bounty is what I typically use for you would use it for like a recruiter. Okay. And most of the time recruiters are typically paid that way. They get some sort of an amount per head in terms of, right, that's a bounty. Yep. You would use it for sales reps going out and getting new customers, right? So if they get, sometimes it's referred to as a new bill to or a new logo or something like that. Or even if it's about getting something that fills in a hole in your network. So if you need to go out, you need to have a sales rep go find you freight that will fill a backhaul that's been problematic to you. You might pay a sales rep a bounty for going and accomplishing that specific thing. And when that lane gets to a certain level, then it triggers the payout. MBOs are somewhat similar, but they're not as directly financially related. They're more strategic. So an MBO, it stands for management by objectives. And that's something where you think of it from a senior leadership perspective. So all of the senior leaders in an organization have initiatives that they are responsible for spearheading. Okay. You, instead of just paying them, you know, an annual bonus based on company profits, you could still do that, but you might take some of the money that would normally go to that, say, let's just say 20,000. Okay. And you're going to say every quarter, we're going to have $5,000 that's tied to the completion of one of your strategic initiatives. And I usually recommend it's not binary. It's not either on or off, because, you know, you can get something partially done. You can get something done even better than expected. So use 5,000 maybe as like your starting point. And then maybe if they got it partly done, they get 3,500, or if they did a great job, they get 7,500. So there's a little bit of flex in there. Try to define it as best you can, so it's clear from the outset what constitutes completion or partial completion or better than. So the rules still apply of like SMART objectives, you know, specific, measurable, attainable, time bound, and relevant, right? You still want to pick all of those things, but it can be a little bit more flexible, because it's going to be stuff like implementing a new TMS system or developing a new driver compensation plan. You know, whatever it is that's the initiative or the objective, that's where an MBO would come into play. KPI tables are typically going to be used for accounting, or potentially for HR or marketing, or any role where they have repetitive metrics that you're tracking them against. So like day sales outstanding, or bills processed, percentage of bills processed within a week, or driver payroll completed on time, right? It's like you have to measure it over and over and over again, and you can set a standard for what you are expecting them to reach in terms of that standard. Terminal operations has a lot of KPIs that are repeated metrics that you want to have them hold to that standard. And so a KPI table will take 4 or 5 of those things, they will weight them out, and then there's only like 5 potential outcomes. So think of it as like a 1 to 5 scale. 1, you didn't do it at all. 2, you did a little bit. 3, you met expectations. 4, you did better. And 5, you did great. So each one of those things is rated on a 1 to 5 scale. You calculate it all up and it tells you how much you should be paid, right? So but it requires that sort of repetitive. We're doing it over and over again. And over time, as they improve their performance, you're going to slide your scale. So what was good before now maybe will become acceptable, right? And you're going to have a different, higher standard for good than you did before. A developmental scorecard is basically like an MBO. Okay, so think about your strategic initiatives that you might use for your senior leaders, but you're going to do it on a really small scale for your rank and file staff. And you're going to give them a handful, 10 or so different little tiny initiatives or things that they can accomplish that's going to help them improve their skill set, their knowledge, their ability in the industry. This one is most handy for IT, because I challenge you, when you and everybody else watching this, leave here and try to think about performance-based incentives for your IT department. And you're not allowed to use lines of code, because the industry did that at the very beginning and it was an absolute disaster because you get bloated code, right? Uptime, system uptime, it's supposed to be 100%. So how are you going to pay them, right? You're going to pay them a positive incentive for being at 99.5. Well, that's kind of a failure. So IT is really hard to do. You can do some stuff with MBOs at the higher level, but if you've got somebody who's just on your help desk, you know, what in the world, how do you pay that person? But could that person watch a YouTube video that starts to help them learn about doing, you know, C# coding, or something that helps them gain more business understanding in terms of knowledge of the trucking industry or how the organization works? So it truly is like personal development that's going to make them better in their job. And so the way this works is their manager will pick out, you know, a handful of things, give them a selection of things that they can choose from, and they pick out what they want to accomplish this quarter. Based on how well they complete those objectives, that determines what incentive they get. The developmental scorecard can be used for a lot of things. It doesn't have to be used for incentive pay. It can be used for incentive pay, it can be used for promotion, it can be used for salary increase at the end of the year, or all of the above, right? But it's a way to outline to them, and I don't want to pick on these kids these days, but they all grew up playing video games, right? They grew up with the concept of leveling up and gathering stuff, you know, whether it's health packs or whatever. I stopped playing video games in the Doom 2 era when it was on like an old computer. But I know how the basic idea of how they work. And so they like the idea of knowing, okay, I got to get this, I got to check this box off, I got to do this, I got to do that, and give me a path, give me a roadmap for what it is I need to do to be successful. Too many businesses just say, well, just come in, do the job, go home. And they don't give anybody an idea of how they can, well, what do I have to do to get to the next level? How do I get promoted? How do I increase my skill set? The developmental scorecard gives them that. So it's a roadmap. I mean, you don't actually have to tie it to anything. It could just be the developmental roadmap for them. Take these classes, watch these videos, read this book, build your knowledge, and that's going to position you to where you can get to the next level.
So how do you answer the question when management comes to you and say, hey, we pay these people a base salary to do those kinds of things? Why are we incentivizing things that should be naturally part of their work day? I guess, how do you answer that one?
Well, a lot of it's about definition. And like I said, you don't actually have to pay people for any of these things. Like, you don't have to pay people for KPIs. I think it's important that you measure them, right? Like, you're not going to run your accounting department and not measure your day sales outstanding, or your percentage of AR that's over 60 days. I mean, that's an important thing for somebody to be looking at. Somebody needs to be looking at your claims ratios. So it's important to measure these things, and tying variable compensation to it in a way makes it mandatory that somebody is actually looking at these metrics, right? So it's sort of a weird little means to an end kind of thing, where if you find you're not really paying attention to it, or you start to pay attention to it and then you stop, if you are having to pay somebody every month based on these objectives, then guess what? You have to look at those objectives every month, because that person's going to come and tell you, hey, I didn't get my check because I did the thing. So it puts teeth in it. It puts teeth in the process. But no, you don't have to pay people, but you do have to tell them what good looks like. If people don't know what's expected of them, they're going to come up with it for themselves. And their definition of good is very likely not going to be management's definition of good, right? And generally speaking, people want to please their managers. They want to please the people that they're working for. You need to tell them what they need to do in order to do that, right? So it's really just about, and this is actually what I tell my clients all the time, it's not the incentive plan you get at the end, right? When you work with me, that's the product, yes. But the value that you get is getting all of your leaders in a room and forcing them to define role by role what is expected and what does good look like. At the end of the day, if you don't ever pay anybody for those things, that's fine. But you guys now have an agreement amongst yourselves of what good looks like. And I spend a lot of time as like a negotiator trying to get people with very different opinions about what's important and what good looks like to come to agreement. I mean, put a sales leader in an asset-based trucking company, put a sales leader, put a safety manager, put your operations leader, put your CFO and your HR person all in a room together and ask them to define good for some of these critical roles. And you now, Matt, you've got my life right there in terms of what I have to do to get them all to come to an agreement. And you have to agree. If you're going to pay somebody to do this, you have to agree what it is.
So in a world where compensation is pretty simple, right? You either get paid by the hour, by the mile, salary, whatever that scenario is. How do you introduce the complexities of a performance-based system into that environment without scaring off your workforce?
That's actually the easiest one to do. So if you're starting with a company where you've never done anything in performance-based incentives, right? As assuming that we agree that you are not making room for the incentive by reducing the fixed pay, right? You don't start there, right? You cannot do that. There have been very, very few circumstances where I've acquiesced to owners wanting to reduce fixed compensation, and it is usually a disaster. right? Because you start out, hey, we've got this great new incentive plan and we're starting out by reducing your salary $5,000 a year. No, you can't, they can't hear you. They're crying in some cases, right? So you start very small. You're not going to put a whole lot of dollars on here because it's going to be extra. It's going to be above and beyond what you have been paying. You might be able to take some of, if you do a regular cost of living increase, 3 to 5% a year, take those dollars in the year that you want to implement your incentive compensation plan, and that becomes your budget for your incentive. So you're still giving them the extra money, but now you're making it performance based. And then the next year, maybe you do that again, and the next year you do it again. And then you're at a point where you've got sort of a reasonable amount of money that's in the incentive compensation plan. And then you can go back to having salary increases. But you're going to start simple, start easy, do quarterly plans, walk before you try to run. So don't go out of the gate saying we're going to measure everybody in the organization on a weekly basis on these complex metrics. Just start easy, start basic, figure it out. Recognize that compensation plans change. They should be updated and tweaked every year. Absolutely, they should be. That doesn't mean swing your staff from one extreme to another, but it means take it from an evolutionary standpoint. We're going to start here and we're going to refine it as we get better, as we learn more, as we develop our metrics more and our tracking systems. Then, 5 years out, we might have what looks like a really strong, sophisticated, performance-based plan.
Well, I know, Beth, I'm looking forward to your presentation at our conference based on this conversation and what I've read in your book. I guess give our viewers, I guess, a little teaser of what they can expect to hear.
Well, I think they probably just heard a lot of it right there, actually. But
we need more so that they make sure that they show up to conventions. So.
I know, so they show up. Well, what I like to do at the conferences, and I've never been to this one before, so I don't know like how many people are there. But if it's a reasonable size audience, I actually like to have them share some of their own stories. And I know because I mean I've seen what I've seen, but they all have lived it. And so for those of you that are going to be coming to the conference, if you've got some great stories of things that worked or didn't work for you that you'd be willing to share with the audience, shoot me an email. My email is beth.carroll, exactly my name. It's on the screen right now, at prosperiogroup.com. Shoot me an email and let me know, hey, I want to share a story with you, and I can make sure to call on you, or you raise your hand or whatever. And it can become more of a learning experience for everybody where we get some more in-depth feedback. And I can go into, like, I like to have a dialogue. So if there's anything that I said today that people want to ask me questions about, feel free to just raise your hand in the middle of the session and we can just have a dialogue about, well, what does it look like if you actually tell me more about the developmental scorecard? How does that work? Or give me more ideas about how you would pay a recruiter, because I actually just did a pretty fun, creative recruiter comp plan for one of the asset-based companies that I work with. So
great. Well, I know I'm excited about it. I think it'll be a great session for everybody, and I'll be taking copious notes, that's for sure. So Beth, thank you for joining us today, and again, look forward to seeing you at our annual conference on September 13th and 14th.
I look forward to being there. Take care.
Great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Beth.
You're welcome.
Looking forward to it. Yeah. We have a comp system here that it was kind of funny when I got hired on. I'm gonna have to make sure I definitely edit this part out. But when I was recruited here, they said, we're going to pay you an incentive. And I'm like, okay. So I got in and I'm like, what's the incentive plan? They're like, you have to make it up. So literally I had to do, and the interesting part is previously the incentives were just doled out. And this is the same thing I have with the trucking company that I work for is at the president and CEO's discretion. So if the company did well, then you did well, and it could vary, and I'm just like, that makes no sense, because people have to know what their markers are. And so this is good stuff. I think a lot of people will be very, very helped out by this process to understand that. Now, there again, as you know, it requires monumental work to get it done. So
yeah.
Good. Great. Thank you so much.
All righty. Thanks. Take care.
Have a good weekend. Bye.
All righty. Bye-bye.